Former President Donald Trump held a rally in Wisconsin today. During his remarks, Trump criticized current leaders and officials, as well as outlined its steps he believes will, quote, break the grip of the Biden-Harris administration. He also touched on his New York hush money case and the 25th Amendment.
And finally, I will support modifying the 25th Amendment to make clear that if a vice president lies or engages in a conspiracy to cover up the incapacity of the President of the United States, if you do that with a cover-up of the President of the United States, it's grounds for impeachment immediately and removal from office.
Trump advisors say Republican vice presidential nominee Senator J.D. Vance is expected to hit the Rust Belt in the final weeks before the election.